Okay, it's 2 minutes past 12, so we should start. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's event. Can British cities lead on net zero? I'm guessing the answer for most of you on the event will be yes. So maybe the more interesting questions are around, are British cities leading on net zero? And if they are, what are they doing? And if they're not, why aren't they leading? And how can we get our cities to do more? We've got three great speakers to explore these questions and many others that we'll get to through the course of the event itself. But before we hear from them, I want to hear from you. So we have a question I'd like you to answer. It's going to appear on the screen in a moment, and you'll get about 20 seconds to say yes or no. And then we'll pop up the answer, and then that'll provide a bit of context for our opening sort of introductory comments from our three speakers. So can we have the first question, please? So the first question should be now on your screen. Are British cities doing enough to deliver on net zero targets? And you have a simple options of either yes or no, and you have roughly 20 seconds or so to do it. So just click yes or no, and I'll just be quiet for 20 seconds while you do it, and then we'll see what you all think. Okay, that seemed to be very quick. Hey, there we go. Unanimous almost, not quite. Are British cities doing enough? 5%, 6 of 117 say yes. Be interesting to know in the Q&A why you say yes. But also 95% say no. And so in the Q&A function, as well as posting your questions to our panelists, you can also put in your reasons for your yes or no, and I'll put them to the panelists as well. So that was it. So 95% say no, 5% say yes. Let's introduce a panel and see what they've got to say. So let me introduce them in turn. The first panel is Valentine Quinio, who's a senior analyst at the Centre for Cities, and she leads on our net zero programme. Our second panelist is Councillor Georgia Gould. Georgia is a leader of Camden Council and the chair of London Councils. And our third panelist is Amy House. Amy is Director of Green Economy. So the way they'll do it is that each of them will take in turn a few minutes to say their opening gambit on this question, on this issue, and then we'll get into Q&A. And as I say, put your Q&A questions or comments in the Q&A function, and I'll be putting them to the panelists when we get to the due point. So, Valentine, nobody thinks that cities are doing enough. Give us your thoughts.
Thanks, Andrew, and hello, everyone. So I'll start with, I think, a positive note, which is that the UK has made good progress on net zero in the past 2 decades. So emissions have been cut in half since 1990. And I'll move to a slightly less positive note now, which is that the issue is that the remaining half of the challenge, so to speak, is likely to be much more difficult for 2 reasons. The first is that it will require us to cut emissions in 2 areas in which we have seen very little progress so far. Those are transport and housing. And the other reason is that it needs to happen now. So 2050 may seem like a distant target, but actually the bulk of the cut emissions needs to happen in the 2020s and the 2030s. And what we also know is that a lot of this progress towards carbon neutrality will have to come not just from technological change, but also from behavior change. So I think this is really a discussion and a reflection on how we can make that happen and how we can facilitate behavior change. Now, looking at the role cities have to play specifically, I think there's 2 ways of approaching this question. The first is looking at cities as a spatial entity and looking at the role cities as an urban built environment can play in helping the UK meet the net zero target. So that's looking at the role urban areas specifically can play. And the second one is looking at cities more as a political entity, and here the discussions around the role local government can play. So I'm sure we'll be discussing both research at the Centre for Cities, show in many ways that those are intertwined and shouldn't be approached in isolation. So I'll just give a couple of opening points on both. So on the first one, cities are often presented as being bad for the environment, being the opposite of green. But actually the evidence on this is very clear and points to the opposite direction. So cities, urban areas do have a low carbon footprint per head than the rest of the country. So people living in cities tend to emit less carbon on average than those who live elsewhere. And that's particularly true when you look at those two sectors on which we need to make progress quickly, which are transport and housing. So I'm sure we'll get into more detail as to why that's the case later, so I won't delve into much into this too far now. But essentially it has to do with the benefits that density, which is unique to cities, brings, and it has a huge influence on our daily lifestyles and by extension on our carbon emissions. So I think that's an important point, setting the scene. So there are, I think, two implications for this. The first is that for the UK to hold a chance to meet its net zero target for 2050, we'll need basically more cities, not less cities. We'll need more people living in cities and building on the benefits that density brings. And the second implication is that we shouldn't expect all parts of the country to cut emissions, at the same pace or to meet net zero at the same time. So the scale of the challenge varies from one place to another. Cities have, greater potential, but therefore also greater responsibility for cutting emissions. And that takes me to the second point, which is more about the role that local government has to play. So net zero is a national strategy. It's a target that's been set by the government. And in fact, a lot of the progress we've seen in the past few years hasn't really been driven by local policy. But I think that can change, and I think it should change. So if you take the transport and housing sectors again, there are loads of levers that can be pulled locally that can really make a difference in terms of cutting carbon emissions. Some of them are already available to local leaders and local decision makers, and some that we need to be devolved or funded properly. So a lot of what we've seen so far is local policymakers and mayors declaring climate emergencies, setting ambitious targets, developing plans, and some action has been taken, and that's really positive. But there's more that can happen at the local level of government.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Valentine, for setting out some of the context, both how cities themselves are, what they're up to, but also how they fit into this kind of program, bigger program of what we're trying to achieve. Georgia, give us your view. I suppose you're wearing several hats at any one moment, but it'd be good to get, not only what's happening at the Camden scale, but at the London scale, and you're involved in kind of multi-city programs as well through the 3CI initiative. So give us your view on this sort of subject and the issues.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I think we weren't allowed as panelists to vote in that poll, but if I could have voted, I would have voted no, because none of us are doing enough. And I think the last year has just shown the extent of the impact that is already happening in our own communities. We saw that during the flooding and the extreme heat and the disproportionate impact that has on disadvantaged communities and overcrowded families, but also globally. And the two biggest communities in Camden are those of Bangladeshi and Somali heritage. And there are two places in the world seeing absolutely devastating climate impact. The floods in Bangladesh affected 7.2 million people, and Somalia is seeing the worst drought in 40 years and is close to famine. And Somalia is a place that I think it produces 0.03% of global emissions. So the inequality and injustice of what's happening is enormous. And so the call on us to go further faster is absolutely right. I think we have seen a shift in the leadership that places, cities and boroughs have taken on the climate crisis. I think we're not waiting for government, but increasingly coming together to take action ourselves. So as Andrew says, I chair London Councils, which is a collective of 33 boroughs in London, so a cross-party collective, and all of us have signed up to a target that we will ensure that all the homes in London are EPC rated B by 2030, which can sound quite dry, but actually it's that would be an enormous shift in the carbon emissions that we produce as a city. And we've come together with the 12 largest cities. They're in a group called Core Cities on a program called 3CI, which is effectively come together to create an action plan on how we decarbonize our cities. and we've done quite a lot of work on it, and there's some eye-watering numbers. So to decarbonise those 12 core cities, and London would take £206 billion. It's 98 billion just for London. I mean, the benefits are enormous in terms of job creation. You'd effectively create a new market, and of course decarbonising, but there isn't that money in the public sector. And if I take it right down to a borough level, we've done a lot of work of what it would take in Camden to decarbonise our council homes, and that's 700 million. And they're just, because of the pressures that we face on council house building and post-COVID, fire safety, damp and mold, all of those things coming together mean there's just not money in the public sector to do that alone. But we're not letting that stop us. So what we're increasingly trying to do is bring private investment in to support us. So, obviously bring the investment we already have and what we can do as councils, but having a completely different conversation with the private sector. And we think that giving that kind of scale of cities coming together creates a much more investable proposition. So we've been working with a number of investors to try and bring projects forward, and we're working on a number of pilot and exemplar projects. But as Valentine said, we have other levers, supporting active travel. When we build ourselves, Camden built the largest passive house scheme in the country, and it's life changing, where tenants are not having to turn on their heating, especially in a cost of living crisis. And we have massive convening power. We can bring coalitions of schools and businesses together. We in Camden we produced a climate bond, which our community invested in to support climate activity. So I think that there has been a lot happening, but I think that there's an increasing recognition that we can't wait for this to be driven centrally. We have to come together. We have huge powers, huge power and influence as cities working together in the UK, but also working with other parts of the world. Powers of convening, powers of procurement, and also the opportunity to really have a different conversation with our communities. And I can talk all day about that, but I know I'm coming to an end. But Camden ran the country's first climate citizens assembly, which have vastly different views as part of it. And but the energy and ideas that came from that have been absolutely enormous. And that, a lot of this has to be how we change our lifestyles, and that has to be grassroots, that has to be community led, and it absolutely has to understand the other pressures people face. The cost of living crisis is devastating people at the moment. So if we're going to have a conversation with them about the climate crisis, it has to align with poverty and unemployment and the other issues they face. And again, I think local leaders can really drive that forward. So looking forward, I think this is such an important conversation. I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes out of it. Thank
you very much, Georgia. It'd be interesting when we get into the Q&A, just your reflections, because we often hear that part of the slower progress maybe than otherwise is because citizens are not fully engaged. They're not pressurizing their politicians to go faster and further. So given you are a politician, it'd be interesting to get your reflections on how much of that is true or how much of that is not true, and what we might do to change some of the dynamics on that. So just have that in your head when we get to the Q&A. Amy, let's go to you. Let's hear your perspective on this question.
Hi everybody, my name is Amy, I'm from Green Economy. So we're part of the growth company which focuses around business support. And what Green Economy is all about is bringing together the tradespeople, the installers, the solution providers that deliver net zero solutions together into one central space, into one online marketplace to try and support that transition to a net zero economy. A couple of things that we do, we work with businesses on that journey to net zero to better understand what products and services are available to them in the marketplace that can make that transition easier, to demystify green tech, and help businesses feel empowered and more comfortable in making those purchasing decisions. and what businesses struggle with, even understanding what net zero means. I think that you start speaking in an echo chamber and you assume that there's this generic understanding, but actually by working with other business support organisations, we found that there's still lots of businesses, and not just small businesses, that are still really struggling to understand what net zero even means, what implications it has for their business. And then the next step is, what technologies are there on the market that can help me? So that's something that's very key to what we do, trying to bring them together. We help them through the online marketplace, and we deliver supplier sourcing days and things like that. And all of that activity is free of charge to businesses on that journey to net zero. And then our core bread and butter is providing support to our businesses with the tools in the hand that provide those solutions. So installers, suppliers of green products and services, heat pump installers, solar PV installers, active travel, green roofs and walls, the full spectrum of products and services there. And what we've been doing with them since 2013, predominantly in Greater Manchester, where we have funding through the CA to deliver that support to them free of charge, is working with them to understand what their barriers and opportunities to growth are and navigate in this turbulent marketplace. And we've known for a really long time that one of the key challenges is that this sector is not supply and demand driven, it's driven by policy and legislation. And that's then where the kind of failings of Westminster to get its act together and creating this turbulence and uncertainty around different policies and the levers that they're pulling really has an impact on the supply chain delivering the answers that we all need and are relying on to help us achieve net zero. And that's where I see the local governments and the roles that they can play and local authorities in providing that level of consistency and a bit of stability. And now, obviously, yes, there's loads of asks that they're asking for, that through consistent policy and consistent funding streams, it would enable them to put bespoke packages of support available to their business base to help them adopt their challenges that they're finding locally, because all local authorities are different. There's still a lot that they can do. So the other activity that we do at Green Economy is working with local authorities to better understand their green economy. And by that, we mean understanding the barriers that are stopping their main business base from transitioning and helping them understand what support they need to put in place, and also helping them what their green tech supply chain looks like, because Greater Manchester's been quite innovative in recognising very early on that encouraging businesses to transition to net zero also has economic gains for the local area if those businesses investing in those products and services are spending that money locally. Every couple of years, we do a sector mapping study for Greater Manchester, and we've just started a project with the local government association so that we can share that expertise more broadly with other local authority areas. But I think what's really key here is that for probably more than 10 years, we've been shouting about the huge growth potential in delivering these products and services. We've heard in the 10-point plan and the plan that went before that, the opportunities for economic growth through growing the green tech sector and the volume of green jobs that are going to be created. But what we're kind of grappling with on the ground is that to maximize those opportunities, we do need some certainty given somewhere so that we can encourage traders that are making money elsewhere to have confidence in this agenda. And if you're installing boilers, go on a training course that they're all free, these days, and start installing heat pumps. But the reality is even if it's a free course, it's still a week out of work. And it seems insane that I think what seems to happen is sometimes in local government, central government, the numbers are so high, businesses with the tools in the hand struggle to relate them to themselves. And I think that that's where the local authorities come into place, because we'd have a much bigger chance of encouraging the tradespeople that we need to get us to net zero to focus on this area, to capitalize on those opportunities and pivot their services for the benefit of the environment if they knew that the investments were worthwhile and that the schemes that they were going to, you know, drive demand in their services, such as the Green Homes Grant, dare I say it, is going to be a long-term initiative and that it is going to be worthwhile for them long-term. I think they're some of the challenges that we've faced when it comes to helping businesses get to net zero and growing that local supply chain. I'm not speaking on behalf of Greater Manchester, but we've done a lot of work with Greater Manchester over the last 10 years, and they've recently been awarded an A-list city and a global leader for taking action on climate change. And they have set very ambitious targets to get to net zero by 2038. They've done a very good job of bringing in local energy plans, leveraging various different funding streams to retrofit public buildings and things like that. But even a global leading city like Greater Manchester still has a very long way to go, which can be quite terrifying at times, because there are some local authority areas that are really blazing ahead with decarbonising their local area, yet there are still lots of local authority areas that have declared a climate emergency but are really struggling to translate that urgency into local policy. And I think that's where relying on individual local authorities that have such discrepancies in their level of expertise and funding to have comparable services. And I think that's where then we either need more devolved powers for those local authority areas or more consistent policy, the central government.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Amy, so it's a kind of interesting set. I'd be interested in your thought around when you're engaging with the business community, what's the balance between the, the awareness of the issue or what the opportunity is versus, real trying to grappling with the technology to actually implement it. So it's a sort of flip version of the question I put to Georgia. Georgia, you kick us off. We've got a couple of questions on this. Georgia, come back in around, the appetite of your citizens, as it were, of your residents or of the community more generally to push politicians maybe further and faster than they would go otherwise. Do you see that on the ground? Is this a growing sort of ambition or an intention? And how should we think about that then as a push towards net zero? Georgia.
We do see it on the ground, and it's definitely been growing, but it's also polarizing. So I think I'll start with, so when we did the Citizens Assembly a few years ago now, we had a really vastly different views in the room, and it was, people who genuinely thought we were persecuting car users, and that exists, in our community, and those who thought, we should literally be banning cars. So they're both there, and that assembly came up with 16 recommendations that had almost unanimous support, and so it was, once we went deeply into the work, it was possible to get that level of consensus. And what's come out of that has been a massive kind of community-led energy and a lot of work to, we opened up a high street space where people would come and just share their ideas of the action they could take. And it was, everything from students talking about clothes swaps to a dad and his daughter who lived on one of our estates who didn't have a garden had this idea of starting a Camden forest where we planted trees around the borough, in kind of communal spaces, and that they all had a story attached to it. And that has been, it was supported by our tree department, but it's become a really community-led project. And there's increasingly work going on our estates to work alongside people about what that kind of, how's that meaningful for them, and sits alongside some of the other challenges they face. And I think that's critical, because if you go into a lot of our communities and say, let's talk about the climate crisis, they're just like, I can't afford to eat right now, like I just don't have the headspace for it. Yeah. But if you talk about setting up a food co-op and how you're using surplus food, and are you doing a local planting project, and of course how you can make energy efficiency changes to your home that will save you money. Those are conversations people really want to have, and there's and often by going in through that other lens, you're getting to quite a powerful conversation about the climate crisis. And across our borough, these sharing spaces that have been set up, where people are kind of sharing skills and sharing what they have. And it started through a kind of community lens, but it's become a really powerful climate project. So I think that there is this groundswell of work happening, but it's not, if you really want it to be more than just a few kind of very engaged and very passionate people, there has to be a lot of work done to make that relevant for people's lives. Yeah. But on the flip side, on the more negative side, there is a polarization, particularly around cars and car space. And, that in Camden, we've been really ambitious in how we've changed our, introducing cycle lanes, introducing low traffic neighborhoods. People might have seen one of the London boroughs, the council meeting had to stop because of a protest about one of their low traffic neighbourhoods. And there is at the same time, some of those changes about changing how places where cars can't go, parking, even any cycle lane that kind of restricts where cars will go. There is a massive concern about that, and some of that is really understandable. People who have mobility issues, but those changes are hard. And so I think there is a danger that climate becomes climate change and the adaptation needed becomes something that's polarized, and you have this anti-movement grow up, and lots of things get caught up in that, which is why I think it's so important you do the community-based work. So you build the coalition rather than having those two extremes that I started with, which absolutely exist. We have to find ways to bring people together, otherwise we will not get there. Yeah, no, that's a great point. We've had several questions around the issue of vehicles and cars and transport, which we'll come on to in a second. I'll get Valentine to maybe start the process, because there's two things. One is about electrification of cars and our ability to move around on the one hand, but particularly for our cities, there is a genuine question, which is about how do we get less vehicles, at least how do we get less big vehicles on the road relative to to other users. And I think that's an important part of the conversation as well. So I get Valentine to come in on that in a second. Amy, just come back to you, just say a little bit about the balance between the awareness, the understanding of the issue, because Georgia makes this point that it's a massive issue and sometimes it's just too big for people to understand it. And that applies to businesses as much as it does to individuals, but then also the technological offer, the technology offer, to the ability to which they can grapple with. How should we think about the balance between those two things, and where might we put some priority in the short run?
Yeah. Where do you start? I mean, in terms of businesses' awareness, I think that we were really concerned at the start of the pandemic. I mean, I know it's a random sentence, everybody was, not about the pandemic, the Greta impact. So we were on a bit of a roll, and that businesses were starting to become more and more aware of, the local authorities had begun declaring climate emergencies. And then when COVID hit, we were thinking that the priorities have shifted. Are people still going to want to invest in mitigating the associated risks from climate change when they've got an immediate risk right in front of their nose? And it's really difficult when the conversation around the climate emergency, the language has changed, but people have heard about it for a really long time. And, you've got people now struggling with anxiety from knowing too much about the climate emergency. And then there's this mid-ground of businesses that know they need to act, but don't fully understand where they can focus their efforts. So there's lots of different support programs available to then try and help businesses navigate that. Greater Manchester has brought out the Be Net Zero campaign, which is a campaign to bring all the businesses together that offer some sort of support in this area, so that Greater Manchester can be the easiest place for a business to become net zero. by having one place that the businesses can land and find out, you know, everything that they need to do to get them to net zero. And I think what's really important is that a lot of the support focuses on small businesses, because the understanding is that they don't have the available money to invest in bringing in expertise to demystify the journey of getting to net zero and putting those relevant actions in place. But the reality is that we get contacted by lots of large businesses that still need support because around the language that's being used. And I still think that there's a lot we need to do around communicating with businesses so that they fully understand what risk they're facing and demystifying what they can do about it. With regards to small businesses, they can sometimes fall into a couple of different camps where a really small micro business can think, well, surely my impact is so small that I'll do my best, but I'm going to have such a small impact here that it's not that relevant. But the reality is the majority of the business space is made up of small businesses. So collectively, as a body, small businesses play a huge part in a city's transition to net zero. The challenge we're facing right now is the cost of living crisis and asking businesses to invest upfront for savings down the line. And something that's really important to us at Green Economy is around fairness, and that investing in green products and services shouldn't just be the right choice. It should be the easiest and the fairest. And it's not always the case, because we are still lacking some finance options for businesses to, you know, take advantage of some of those schemes. And some of the schemes that have been brought in have not stuck around long enough for businesses to fully understand how they can benefit, apply, take advantage before it's then whipped away again. So, you know, over the last couple of years, I've already mentioned the Green Homes Grant, but we've seen initiatives from central government that have probably just added to the turbulency. So I think that there's a lot that needs to be done to help businesses fully understand what the environmental impact and the business risk means to them individually. I think that there's more that we can do to help businesses understand what technology is available and what services are available for businesses to better understand the data. And by that, I mean better understand what their climate implications are, and also understand where they themselves can make savings. So we work with the Pilot Group and many others that provide energy management systems, and they are desperate to convey the value of having an energy management system and how that can help you understand where behavior changes and changing your operating times and the way that you run your business without making further investments can save you money year on year. So we're really trying to now share some of that knowledge and give businesses better access to the supply chain so that they can dip the toe in the water, find out what different services are available to them. Because if we want businesses to make uncomfortable financial decisions today, they need to have the confidence to do that. And it's only human nature that we don't like buying things we don't really understand, especially when money is so tight.
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, I'd be interested in your thoughts as we move on in terms of the, you know, there's a risk element, reducing risk, but you also talked about, Georgia talked about the upside, the opportunity if you're in the business community or in the, you know, there are genuine, or if you're an individual looking to acquire new skills, genuine opportunities to actually access some of the opportunities that will be created as we transition towards net zero and to a greener
yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Think about that and come back. Valentine, just touch a little bit more on, so we've had several questions and queries around, you know, the role of transport. You talked a little bit of the role of housing. How do we think about that? Where, you know, where are cities at in terms of thinking about those kinds of issues?
So I think that the starting point is that because our daily lifestyles are so influenced by the built environment that we live in, you know, that explains why one of the reasons why cities have a lower carbon footprint than the rest of the country is because of the benefits that density bring. So if you take transport, so transport is the main source of carbon emissions now, so it's one of the biggest challenges. In terms of transport, density means that distances are shorter, so they can more easily be walked or cycled. And density also means that public transport is more viable because of high levels of demand. So, one of the reasons why in London, you can catch a bus without even having to check the timetable is because the levels of demand are big enough for operators to run in London, and that's not the case in other parts of the country. So I think in terms of the transition away from car towards more, clean forms of transport, I think there's an interesting point that Georgia made earlier about this sort of polarizing issue in terms of, leaving cars behind and moving towards public transport and active travel. I think this has become even more interesting recently with the sort of current debate on the energy crisis and the fact that, fuel has become one of the main, sources of sort of expense in terms of budget for different people. And I think that's become particularly acute in some parts of the country that have become more reliant on fuel prices going up. So in a way, people in London who rely more on public transport have been, less exposed and less vulnerable to those increases in prices. That slightly changed the conversation around, the need for us to cut energy, and the fact that this is quite still a polarizing issue. I think, again, that takes us to the point I made earlier about the fact that not all places will have to move away from car ownership at the same time and at the same pace. And, the transition to away from cars, maybe to electric vehicles, for instance, will be a very important one. But I would say in cities, particularly where the potential for public transport uptake is higher, the journeys that are currently being made by car that are, say, under 2 or 3 kilometers will not have, in an ideal world, will not move from a petrol diesel car to an electric car, but towards other forms of travel. And I think that's, quite an important point to make, because electric vehicles, yes, they emit less carbon, but they take the same space on roads. And so, they would take the space that more buses or more cycle lanes would need for active travel to become, a sort of bigger use and transport mode.
Brilliant, great, thank you very much. Georgia, come back in on that issue. I mean, obviously you're in London and of London, represent London, and London, as we know, for a whole variety of different reasons, is exceptional relative to many other, or if not most parts of the country. But it's an interesting question, I suppose, around the centrality of transport-related issues in relation to achieving net zero, and then some of the issues and options associated with that. Do you think we give enough attention to the role of transport broadly in terms of getting us closer to net zero than not, or do we tend to fixate on other sorts of issues?
I mean, I think the elephant in the room on all of this is that we are still one of the most centralized countries the most centralized country in Europe. And because of that, most of the levers on transport don't actually sit with local government. So when I talk to leaders in other parts of the country, some, they are absolutely desperate. The number one thing they would like to do is increase public transport. They absolutely get it. They want to introduce more electric buses, more trains. They're so frustrated that it's faster often to get to London than it is between different cities. But all of that investment and all of that levers still kind of sit centrally. And even when they are wanting to bring some of that transport network into public ownership, it's incredibly difficult, and often they don't have the powers to do so. So I think that a lot of the questions asked, like, why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? We just don't have the power. So we're waiting for central government. We don't have the power and we don't have the resources. And even when public transport does kind of sit closer to community, so it does in London, in that it's a responsibility of the Mayor of London. It's been a political football on funding for the last few years, and what we're ending up seeing is cuts to the public transport network rather than investment, and that's not a choice of London. It's a choice of national government. And so if we could keep some of the road taxes that are produced, or some of the revenue associated with the use of cars, then we could invest in this stuff. So I think absolutely we recognize it's critical where there's the levers are limited. I think where we do have levers is around supporting active travel, and I think that's where you have seen a lot happen. And even during COVID, in Camden we trebled the segregated cycle lanes during COVID, so there's been that push. And I think it's also just holding your nerve, because the issue is you need to wait. People won't really change how they travel until there is an integrated network. You know, when I talk to so many people, like, I'd love to cycle in my community, but I'm terrified. And with you know, Camden's pretty good for cycling, but you know, it's that integration. So you need to reach a point where everything is connected, and that. But in the meantime, sometimes it does feel like traffic. I think that's where we do, you know, that is the area where that does require local leadership, and we are seeing it, but we could definitely do more.
Brilliant. Well, that perfectly tees up. So a question 2 on our poll. So can we get question 2 up, which is basically asking a question as to why maybe we haven't seen some of the progress or what we think. And then, so we'll do the same again. So here's question 2. What is the main barrier to British cities making progress on net zero? And 95% of you said that, you know, they're not making as much progress as we would ideally want. There'll be other options, and they're all important, but we want you to make only one choice. Just that's prioritization. We believe in a bit of that. So let's just, you know, lack of powers, lack of funding, lack of political will. Vote, and we'll get the answers in a few seconds, and then we'll come back to that. Another question, Amy, while it's related to this, which you can reflect on, but it touches a little bit on government role. Anika Gilbert asks a question as how does government create the confidence that you talked about in order to see businesses follow on in terms of investment, whether it's a new product, whether it's new technology, or whether it's new skills. So have that in mind when we come to it as well. So let's see the answers to the poll. So then all of these issues are important, but at 50%, so 1 in 2 are saying lack of funding is the main barrier for cities. And then lack of powers, lack of will is kind of evenly split between the other 50%, which is kind of interesting. So money is the problem primarily as you see it. Good. Okay, so if we can close that, I'd be interested as well on that. Valentine, give us some reflections on that. We've thought about not only what cities are doing, but what they're up to, and then I'll get Amy to come in on that as well. Valentine.
Yeah, that's a really difficult question choosing between those 3. I think if I had to pick one, I would say that probably powers is the biggest issue. So, you know, we were talking earlier about, you know, the need to integrate, you know, transport with, you know, density, and therefore the way, you know, urban form and planning. Effectively in the UK at the moment, no local leader, with the exception of the Mayor of London, has powers to integrate within a sort of single coordinated strategy. In the case of London, that's the London Plan, transport and planning policy. So that allows him to build build housing near public transport, and then you know, run your routes where people live. So in London, for instance, I think there's a tool that's called the public transport accessibility levels, which is used essentially to optimize density levels with transport provision. And that's, you know, only in London the mayor has those powers. Everywhere else is highly fragmented. It's either split between different levels of government or still in Whitehall. So to use an example, again, on the sort of planning and transport front, I think district councils are the local planning authority, and county councils are the transport and strategies, both on transport and planning. And again, the transport front, many cities don't have powers over public transport revenues and the revenues it generates. You know, this is changing in places like Manchester, for instance, and other places, you know, do have the power to start, for instance, bus franchising, but that's not happened yet elsewhere in the country.
Great. Amy, I'm going to come to you in a second. George, do you want a quick reflection on that? So, you know, money was the main, and then evenly split between the 3. Obviously, they're all important. You know, we get that, but just your kind of reflection on that. Again, London is slightly exceptional in terms of, can you be slightly exceptional? I don't know. It's different. It's reasonably different from other parts of the country. That's for certain.
I actually agree that powers is the most important thing, because I think we, you know, where we are, I mean, investment is a massive issue, and there is not the money. You know, we're seeing local government has been decimated, and there's a real lack of capacity and huge pressures on our budgets, and it's getting worse because of inflation. In London, I think there's across all London boroughs a 300 million gap this year and 700 million gap next year. And so to kind of continue to invest in everything we're talking about requires capacity, and so money is an issue. But I do think if we have more powers, we could do more to generate some of that money, bring in private investment. And we still do, I think, a huge amount with the limited powers we have. Even in London, people talk about London, but compare that to a kind of global city like New York. I mean, it's not comparable.
Yeah, more exceptional in a British sense.
Yeah, in a British sense, but actually we really don't have a lot of powers on these issues, and certainly not the power to generate revenue. So more powers will give us more money.
And on the revenue generation side would be the sort of the broad area that you'd be interested in, George? Is that what that's what you're kind of focused on if you had to focus on one area?
Yeah, I mean, I think the power to generate revenue, but I think what Amy's been saying about certainty in the regulatory environment is absolutely critical. Yeah. And that, housing is still being built today that will need to be retrofit in the future. That is unacceptable. And we need a much stronger regulatory environment.
Yeah, great. Amy, come in on that, because you talked about, the people you work with, the businesses you work with, crying out for certainty on policy direction, and therefore the flows of finance and funding, etc. Are there specific things that they are desperate for certainty around, beyond the general sense of slightly less chaos would be helpful?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I think that, part of it, I think, is by leading by example, because, we're going to all the various COPs and we're saying that, it's an emergency. We really need to act now. But the UK government had its net zero strategy contested back in August because there was no clear defined plan of how it was going to be delivered. So we've got till March 23 for that to be revised and clear plans put in place. And I think that we need long-term strategies that stay, whoever's in charge, if it's the right thing, we're all agreed, we need to improve the energy efficiency of our infrastructure, and we need to invest in the right technologies. But there's a lot of narrative to say that this is what needs to be done, but then a scheme will be brought out for 6 months and then it will disappear again. Now, that doesn't give confidence to the business or the homeowner that we're asking to contribute and invest, that it is definitely the right thing to do. And also, there are still challenges around the skills gap within the green tech sector. We know that we know that we need to install over 100,000 heat pumps, but we don't currently have the installer base to deliver those. And it's not easy to give confidence to the plumbers with those relevant skills and expertise to diversify without knowing that people are going to be demanding and uptaking heat pumps. So if there was a clear strategy and there were clear incentives that businesses could access with enough time for them to fully understand what it is, get to grips with it, apply, hear from their neighbour and their friend and their cousin who's benefited, so that the demand is then naturally driven up, just to support that initial first step, to make it comfortable for people. Once then people start gaining trust in the process, businesses are then investing in their workforce so that delays on kit and installs can be a lot quicker, then the customer journey will be a lot more comfortable too. But it's a real chicken and egg scenario. If we manage to convince all of the homeowners to retrofit their homes starting tomorrow, do we have enough retrofit installers to deliver it? No, we don't. But how can we convince the retrofit workforce to invest and prepare for it if we're not 100% sure that we can convince the business base to take those first steps? Yeah. So I think is
there a role? I'll bring Valentine in on this question as well, but is there a role for cities in trying to do that, Amy, in a sense that this is, somewheres between bridging the need to get individuals, whether they're businesses or people, to behave differently and make different choices, with national government doing whatever it's doing? Is there a role for cities, which is partly what Georgia was talking about earlier on in the work that you've been doing with core cities and others, an aggregation function? That's really what we're looking for from our cities to try and aggregate the demand in, then to bring about some kind of supply response, whether it's at the national level or whatever. Is that what we want from our cities, Amy?
Yeah, definitely. And I think if we use Greater Manchester as a good example, because they've been very successful in drawing down the funds that have been available. So the Green Homes Grant Local Authority Scheme, for example, but that was no mean feat, you know, getting those applications, and it's a hell of a lot of work for the local authorities to do it. And the timescales that they were put upon to submit those applications, to deliver the work, to get the feasibility work in. Again, the restricted timescales in which the local authorities had to react to implement those schemes also presented challenges for the local authorities drawing down that money, and challenges for the supply chain to quickly scale up and meet that demand. And yes, in Manchester, we have a thriving green tech sector. It's growing year on year. And there is no doubt that the local backing, Andy Burnham's annual Green Summit, and the declaration that GM will be net zero by 2038 has given solid intent and confidence to GM businesses that this is an agenda that Greater Manchester is committed to.
Yeah.
However, there are those still fundamental issues around creating the demand for the businesses to then take those measures. But I feel like we've been on the verge of something is coming for a really long time now.
Yeah, no, quite. Valentine, come in on this, because this is the second point that you made right at the beginning. You talked about literally how cities are and how they form and the function and all the rest of it. But you also talk about cities as actors, as agents in the system. And this is really what we're trying to talk about, right? How they organize the supply and demand questions in relation to this part of the economy and to the society.
Yeah, I think on the housing and the retrofits front specifically, you know, I do find it very interesting that the local part of the Green Homes Grant hasn't been scrapped, like Amy just mentioned. And I think that's, you know, it's interesting because it actually shows that they still do have powers to retrofit homes in their area. Now, I do think on that specific agenda, you know, it has to be a national target and a national agenda. So, you know, we need to see government step in with the retrofits. So they've announced, I think, recently a retrofit task force, which is really good news, and it's been, you know, long awaited. But we need to see an equivalent of the Green Homes Grants to, you know, to help people, you know, retrofit their homes, cut energy bills, and cut energy consumption. In terms of what local authorities can do on that front, I think it's more on the supply side. So, you know, at the moment, they don't have the skills, well, they don't have the powers to work on the skills of the workforce, particularly on that sort of supply side, you know, getting more people in the workforce in those retrofitting industries. And that's a problem because they do have the knowledge of what's needed in the local area. So that should change, you know, in order to, you know, to bring sort of those industries at scale and therefore, you know, help retrofit more homes in the country.
Brilliant. Okay. Georgia, bring you in. Just before we do, two more recent questions, which amazingly have flipped either side of the quiz. So one is from John Sace. He's put a couple in, and he's from Swansea. I'm from Swansea as well, John. So we should commiserate outside of this meeting about what's going on there. But he says, basically, paraphrasing, in Wales, there is quite a bit of money available for this, but lots of the local authorities don't do it because they're obsessed with cars and they're dominated by car users, and therefore they don't want to get into this kind of space. So the political drive, which you talked a little bit about. And then on the flip side, again, we've had several comments and questions from Sinclair Lang, who basically says, this is all madness. I go to these loads of events. We all agree on the issue. We know that central government's a problem, but, you know, what is going on? How do we break out of this cycle of madness and nothing ever happens? So, Georgia, you're the politician. Put yourself in between the two of those sort of.
Well, I am a Labour politician.
Not doing it.
So I would say, as a Labour politician, I would say, what has been the problem over the last 12 years? But in all seriousness, I do think Labour has put forward a 28 billion per year investment, which would make a massive difference, you know, in actually bringing these projects we've talked about to life. And so I do think there needs to be better political leadership in terms of investment and that kind of certainty, either in subsidy or regulation. I think that would really help. But just on the positive, I mean, I've been going to these conversations as well for the last year, or many more years. But I think that on the ground there is real change happening, and it is slower than we would like, but we are plugging away at some of these questions. And the reason retrofit is so slow is because it's hard to get a return on investment. If solar panels are much easier, and renewable energy, because you get a return on investment. So some of those projects are moving ahead at a much faster pace, but decarbonising our buildings is harder. And we've been trying to look at models to make that accessible. So I think we've kind of found two. One is that you kind of bring together the investment in a place, so you have some renewables, some electrification where there's a return, some kind of co-investment because of the co-benefits around health and flood resilience, all those things. So you try and bring in co-investment to decarbonize an area together. And then the other is looking at like energy sprung pilots where you're using some of the savings in energy costs to at least have some of a return on investment and make some of these projects viable. And we've been doing a lot of work with investors, and we're at the stage of like looking at individual houses and pilots and so on. And if we can get that right, if we can find and I'm hoping that we can do that in the next few months, we can scale that really quickly. As we've heard, the core cities working together, we're looking at it together, we're piloting different systems, and we have a commitment to use a shared framework to scale. And I do think in this, local government can be market shapers, because if we're focused on our own stock because it's easier and we have access, but I think also critically because of the social justice element, our stock is council housing. It tends to be our poorer residents. So energy savings have a double benefit. And we're also looking at the same time as we're working with colleges to bring forward the skills and the training that would enable that to happen. So if we create the demand through some of our own stock, that generates a new market that I think would give the confidence of private homeowners and the commercial sector to come forward, and also creates a skill base that can work across both. And so I do think it's shifting. I do think there's a lot we can do, even ourselves. It's much slower than we would like.
Of course.
Keep going,
Yeah.
and we will then be in a much better position if the national policy environment changes. Brilliant.
Well, as we edge towards 1 o'clock, that's a good optimistic view from you, Georgia, to bring us to a close. Amy, give us an equally optimistic kind of view on progress. It's not as fast as we would like, but how do you see it playing out now over the next period?
In terms of the capacity, so the businesses that we're working with through Green Economy, a few years ago, we were helping them raise their profile and access sales opportunities because they were going in peaks and troughs. Whereas at the moment, my advisors are having their catch-up calls with them in the car because they're inundated with requests for different technologies. And like Georgia said, lots of people can quite easily get their head around the benefits of solar PV. And I think what we're doing now is just to try and kind of increase the profile of some of those less well-known technologies. And let's face it, people just don't find energy efficiency as exciting as probably I do. And also there are discrepancies as well in funding activity. You could fund a sofa interest-free credit for over 4 years, but you can't do that for loft insulation. And the reality is a new sofa might bring joy, and loft insulation to the majority probably not. So there's still lots of work that needs to be done about educating people, but I think we're definitely getting there. I mean, it's taken the cost of living crisis for people to switch from using dryers and are now taking a lot more notice in this space. Yeah. And we have had, through our marketplace, way more inquiries for insulators. So we've been running campaigns to try and find more of them and encourage people to use our Green Skills Academy that the growth company runs to develop those skills, because we're definitely seeing that demand, and that for us is hugely positive.
Good. Another positive note from you. I think
you prepped me. You said I had to be positive to end on.
Energy prices stays high. Yeah, if energy prices stay as high as they are, I think people will start to love loft insulation quite a lot.
Yeah, me
And
too.
get a lot of joy out of it as well, but that's a different issue for another day. Valentine, give us your final closing thoughts on where we are on this issue.
In terms of being positive, I think the most, probably the most positive thing that I've noticed in the past few years is that there's, I think, a growing consensus that net zero is a priority. It's a growing concern from many parts of the electorate, and not just from across the political spectrum, which in theory makes it an easier sell for politicians, not just to commit to targets, but also to specific carbon reduction measures. So I think that also probably explains why different local leaders have been taking positive action, because they know that actually it's a very important issue for people in their area. So that's probably one of my, if I had to put my optimistic hat on, that's probably the main thing I'm sort of confident about.
Good. It's a nice hat to wear on occasions. Maybe we don't always wear it on enough occasions, but it's a nice hat to wear when we can do it. It's just gone 1 o'clock, so we definitely could go on, but we can't, sadly. Huge thanks to my panel, to Georgia, to Valentine, and to Amy. Thank you very much for your thoughts and your time. Hugely appreciate it. Thank you all for joining. Loads of great questions, loads of great comments as well. So thank you very much for that. If you're interested in our work around cities and net zero, you can find it all on our website, centreforcities.org. But until the next time, take care and stay safe. Thanks for being part of the scheme. Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care, Georgia. Take care, Amy. Bye.